Hi, everyone. Welcome to part one of Reconstruction. With this topic, we are discussing the problem of how do we reconstruct the Union in the wake of the South military defeat. And it's going to be one of the most difficult and perplexing challenges ever faced by American policymakers. Our questions to think about here: what was President Lincoln's philosophy towards Reconstruction? How did it differ from President Johnson's? And how effective were these Reconstruction programs? Abraham Lincoln was operating under the theory that secession was illegal, and therefore it was impossible for the Southern states to actually leave the Union. And so, since it wasn't possible to secede, then it really was the Southern people who rebelled against the authority of the United States. And therefore, he could use his power of the pardon to bring those rebels back into the United States. And this is President Lincoln's plan. We refer to it as the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. And he proposes this in December of 1863, so well before the end of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln's plan is sometimes described as lenient because it would only require 10% of a state's population to take an oath of loyalty. Congress, on the other hand, is concerned about the Southern states not being punished. Abraham Lincoln's philosophy is that if we punish the Southern states very harshly, then they're going to be bitter and angry, and we're not going to fully reunite the Union. On the other hand, Congress looks around at all of the death and destruction and says the Southern states need to be punished for this. So they counteroffer, and this is the Wade-Davis bill. Instead of requiring only 10% of a state's voting population to take an oath of loyalty, the Wade-Davis bill is going to require 51% of a state's voting population to take the oath. When Congress passes the Wade-Davis bill, Abraham Lincoln vetoes it. He also recognizes, though, that he's going to have to do more to work with the growing radical Republican element in Congress in order to get things done. Unfortunately, Abraham Lincoln is not going to have that opportunity. On April 14th, 1865, less than a week after Robert E. Lee surrendered to federal troops, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by a Southern sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth. As the details unfolded, it became clear that Lincoln's assassination was part of a larger conspiracy to eliminate members of the government. And this led to widespread concern about Southern intentions. I mean, was the South really interested in reconciliation? The vice president, Andrew Johnson, now becomes the president. And what's interesting about Andrew Johnson is that he's actually a Democrat. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. But when Abraham Lincoln was running for re-election in 1864, he chose Andrew Johnson deliberately. When the state of Tennessee voted to secede from the Union, Senator Andrew Johnson didn't go along with this. In fact, he was the only Southern member of Congress not to leave Congress when their state seceded. And so in 1864, as part of a so-called unity ticket, Republican Abraham Lincoln selects Southerner Democrat Andrew Johnson as his running mate. And then, of course, when Lincoln is assassinated, Andrew Johnson becomes the president. Andrew Johnson comes from really humble stock. He was born into a very poor family in North Carolina. He migrated as a young man to Eastern Tennessee, where he made his living as a tailor. He didn't go to any sort of formal school. In fact, he didn't learn to read and write until he was an adult, when his wife taught him. So this is important in understanding where he comes from, because he has no great love of the planter class. But at the same time, as a Jacksonian Democrat, he is most concerned with making Reconstruction as quick and as painless as possible. So the only thing that Andrew Johnson is asking of the Southern states is to overturn their ordinances of secession and to ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. He really does not want to make this difficult for the Southern states. And like Abraham Lincoln, he believes that if the Southerners are severely punished, they're just going to be angry and bitter. But Andrew Johnson's leniency, it sort of encourages bad behavior on the part of Southerners. The Black Codes were laws, state laws, that were passed in order to limit the political and economic freedom of former slaves. By restricting freedoms and forcing African Americans into restrictive labor contracts, the Black Codes demonstrated that the Southern states were unwilling to recognize African American rights. Specifically, they are going to take advantage of a loophole within the 13th Amendment. So when you take a look at the 13th Amendment, the language is incredibly brief. It basically says that slavery or involuntary servitude, unless as punishment for a crime, is illegal. And of course, what these state laws do, what these Black Codes do, is they make a whole bunch of things illegal, but just for African Americans. So these people could be arrested, tried, convicted, and then forced to work on sometimes the very plantations that they escaped. The other thing that's going to come out of this is the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was created in 1866 in Tennessee, and initially it was a political organization. But the growth of the Klan represents this interesting moment in Southern society. When you take a closer look at the 14th Amendment that we'll get to in a moment, the 14th Amendment takes away many voting privileges and legal rights for men who supported the Confederacy. And so you'll see on the screen here, I said they used violence and terrorism to reassert white Southern masculinity. We have this situation where Black men in the South have gained political rights at the same time that white Southern men have lost political rights. So in order to reassert their masculinity and their position in society, white Southern men are going to use violence, terrorism, and intimidation, and even murder to assert their dominance within Southern society. And it's important to understand when and why the Klan is born and grows. It's in this moment when white Southern men do not have a legitimate political power, so they're going to use other means to assert their dominance. So coming back to our questions to think about, what was President Lincoln's philosophy towards Reconstruction? He wanted this to be as quick and as painless as possible. And he honestly believes that secession is not legal under the rules of the Constitution. Therefore, the Confederate States never left the Union. The Confederate States of America were never legally created. But it was the Southern people who rebelled so that he could use his authority as the president to pardon those individuals. How does it differ from President Andrew Johnson's? Really, not much. I mean, Andrew Johnson is really looking for the same thing, for Reconstruction to be quick and painless. And so Johnson only requires that the Southern states overturn their ordinances of secession and that they ratify the 13th Amendment. And then how effective were these Reconstruction programs? Not much. I mean, we do see some effort to reconstruct the Southern states, but what we're going to see in part 2 is that we have a growing element in Congress, a much more liberal wing of the Republican Party coming to the forefront. So stay tuned for part 2 of Reconstruction.